Incident at Hawks Hill by Alan W. Eckert. Prologue. The Indians knew this powerful northward flowing stream best. Closer to its headwaters, the Dakota Sioux had named it the Wooded River, because of the trees growing so densely along its banks, in a land where trees were scarce. The Cree Indians near its mouth named it the Murky Water, which in their language was Winnipeg. Then the white men came, and they had a name of their own for it, rather close in meaning to the Cree name, but not quite the same. They named it for the muddy color of the water. By the time this river flowed into Lake Winnipeg, some 300 miles from its source, 23 major streams had joined it, each carrying its own silt deposits, which during much of the year turned the water a reddish-brown. The white men called it Red River. Last and largest of the major tributaries was the Assiniboine, flowing eastward from the wilderness of Saskatchewan. And where these two rivers met, the Red River became a formidable stream indeed. A city was here now, in this year of 1870, almost as if in apology to the Indians who had been uprooted by the coming here of white men. It had been named what the Cree had called the stream, Winnipeg, and it was the largest city for over 500 miles in any direction. It also held the promise of becoming considerably larger in the near future. 45 miles to the north of this vigorous young city was where the Red River emptied into the gigantic Lake Winnipeg. From the frontier city northward, for the first 30 miles toward the lake, it snaked its way through a vast rolling prairie land, a sea of buffalo grass, with only here and there little islands of low trees and occasional rock formations jutting above the grasses. And now this ocean of wild grasses had commenced giving way to a sea of wheat, for this was very fertile land, ripe for the plow and rich in the nutrients required for growing the crop, which was the staff of life. Less than 20 miles to the north of Winnipeg, in this year, the wild prairies were still largely unchanged. Here and there grew neatly squared fields of wheat, but mostly the gently rolling hills were still cloaked in their original garb of buffalo grass, punctuated by stark rock formations. And on one of the hills stood a cluster of buildings, a substantial home, large barn, numerous sheds, and outbuildings. In many respects it was still crude and rough, but like the very face of this land, each year it was changing. This was the farm of William MacDonald. 20 years ago, with his bride beside him, MacDonald had come here, generally following the Red River down from Winnipeg. They had started out from Toronto, where so recently they had been married. Their plans had been nebulous, and they knew only that they wanted to settle new land somewhere in the Winnipeg area, though neither had ever been here, and they had no idea where they would finally stop. Both were confident that when they arrived at the right place, they would know it at once. The journey to Winnipeg had been long and hard, and they had tarried there for several days, masking the sharp disappointment they felt when they learned that most of the land close into the city had already been claimed and was being farmed, especially the areas to the east and south and west of Winnipeg. To the north, they were told, the prairie land abruptly gave way to forest land, which was unfit for crops, so expansion in that direction had thus far been lightest. But, and their hopes had suddenly soared, there was still some prairie land unclaimed in the 30 miles northward, before the forest line was encountered. And so they had headed that way, down the west side of the Red River, and not until they were 2 days from the city, in the vast rolling prairie land, did the countryside open up for settlement. Then, in the late afternoon of their second day out of Winnipeg, weary of walking beside their plodding oxen, they had stopped atop this very knoll to let the laboring team blow and rest from the efforts of pulling their large creaking wagon. They stood quietly, this man and woman, with their arms linked and letting their gaze drink in this lonely but appealing landscape. They had been a handsome couple. William MacDonald was of hardy Scots parentage, tall and angular, his face Indian-like in the craggy hawkishness of his features, though there was no Indian blood in him. A well-educated man, his hands were heavily calloused. This had come about through choice rather than necessity. He loved land, and he loved working the soil and growing things on the land. He was rather slender, but there was the look of quiet strength about him. It was an aura shared by his bride, Esther. An intelligent and gentle woman, she was a head shorter than her husband, dark-haired and imbued with an attractiveness which not even the grinding weariness of this long journey by ox cart could alter. If, as well there might be, there was any fear in her breast for what lay ahead of them, she showed no sign of it. Both were aware that hardships were ahead of them, but when such bad times came, they would be met. It was that simple. 20 years ago it was, in 1850, that they had paused on this knoll and stood silently together, while gradually the labored breathing of the oxen diminished until no longer audible. The stillness of the great prairie land had closed in around them, yet it was not quite a true silence, for always there was the faint swishing whisper of the breeze touching and rippling the knee-high grasses. There was a strangely comforting tranquility to this place, which touched them deeply, and made words between them unnecessary. It was as they had stood thus, unspeaking, that there came a cry, a bell clear, piercing, cree, 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 and both of them had looked up to see a magnificent red-tailed hawk circling gracefully, effortlessly, on broad outstretched wings. They had looked at one another then, William and Esther MacDonald, and still without a word passing between them, they had known without doubt that this was it, that this very spot was the place where at last they would sink their roots with permanence. On that self-same day, they had named the knoll Hawk's Hill, in honor of the large bird of prey that had greeted them. To north and south and west, the prairies rolled endlessly in gently sloped hills, like this one, until they touched the horizon. But to the east, the land angled downward into the valley of the Red River, less than a mile distant. The woods flanking the watercourse there formed a dark, undulating line through the otherwise treeless land, heading for that point another 10 miles to the north, where they would spread out into a vast unbroken forest. At first they had built a cabin here and cultivated only a small area, but as the years passed, the cabin became a good roomy house, close to a large barn, and there were other outbuildings which followed. With each nail driven, the roots of the MacDonald family became more solidly set. They had gradually acquired some sheep and horses and a good milk cow, and just as they took onto themselves the land, so too the land took them, and they became a part of it, growing to love it with the fierce intensity that is the hallmark of the pioneer settler. Even though it was a young country here, already it was steeped with a rich tradition of history. This was Indian land, or at least it still had been when they first arrived. Roving bands of Crees had then lived on these prairies, frequently moving their impermanent villages as they fished in the rivers, hunted across the plains for buffalo, netted great numbers of ducks and geese in the multitudes of marshy potholes which dotted the landscape, trapped the fox, mink, beaver, otter, badger, marten, and other fur-bearers for trade with the white men of the Hudson Bay Company. They had changed, too. In just this score of years, the Indians had nearly disappeared, moving westward with the ever-diminishing herds of buffalo, until now it had become something of a rarity to see one of those great shaggy animals, or one of the red men who hunted them. The MacDonalds had come to know the history of Winnipeg almost as well as they knew their own Hawk's Hill. It was a Frenchman, La Vérendrye, searching for a route to the Pacific, who first came to the confluence of the Red and Assaboine in 1738 and erected Fort Rouge. But the place had been soon abandoned, and before white men came here again, Canada had been lost by the French to the English. Thus, in 1806, the Northwest Company had come and established Fort Gibraltar on the spot where Fort Rouge had been, and they established as well a fur trading empire. It was an empire soon to be challenged by the already powerful Hudson's Bay Company under the leadership of Lord Selkirk. On his orders, the company built Fort Douglas close by, and competitive friction developed. The Nor'westers were not as far-sighted as Selkirk, who quickly recognized the potential of the land for more than merely fur. He realized its fertility and its value for settlement. Over a period of 4 years, he brought in 300 families from his native Scotland to settle the raw land, mostly in the vicinity of the two forts and to the south and west of them. The hardships were many, but the new settlers overcame them and built a strong colony adjacent to the forts. Friction between the two companies degenerated to actual bloody warfare before at last, in 1821, they resolved their differences and merged under the name of the Hudson's Bay Company. The company, which had seized and destroyed Fort Gibraltar in 1816, built Fort Garry on the site, and it quickly became the territory's foremost trading post and settlers' depot. A second Fort Garry was built in 1835, and the town which then formed around it was named Winnipeg. And now in this year of 1870, a great change had taken place. The Hudson's Bay Company had just transferred title of the entire territory to the Canadian government, and a territorial governor had been seated at Fort Garry. There was talk that very soon a railroad would link Winnipeg with the east. When that happened, the city would virtually burst its seams with growth. A number of little satellite communities were springing up, and there were many churches and reasonably good resident-supported schools. Roads were becoming built, and farming, rather than fur trading, was becoming the heartbeat of the economy. For the MacDonalds, the passage of these 2 decades had brought about many changes. Children had come. First John in 1854, followed by Beth in 1858, which was the same year that the Minnesota Territory, 60 miles south of Winnipeg, was admitted into the Union of the United States. Coral was born only 9 years ago, and in that same year of 1861, the Dakota Territory was established, also by the United States government. Finally, 3 years later, Benjamin had been born. It was strange that in this period of development, when empires and governments were being established, when civilization was carving its way into the raw Canadian wilderness, the greatest problem of the MacDonald family should center round the 6-year-old son.